Hi, I'm Bob German, and welcome to Building Flexible SharePoint Solutions with AngularJS. I'm really excited to be speaking at the Collab 365 Global Conference, and I hope you enjoyed the session as much as I enjoyed putting it together. My name is Bob German, as I said, and I'm a principal architect at a company called Blue Metal. We're a consulting company where we do a lot of development for Office 365 as well as other cloud and devices and all sorts of other things. Please follow me at Bob1German or check out my blog at bob1german.com. Today I want to talk about Angular and how to use it more effectively inside of your SharePoint solutions and modern SharePoint solutions that work equally well in Office 365 or on premises. We'll start with an introduction to AngularJS. I'm not going to assume that you know Angular, but I am going to assume that you know JavaScript and some SharePoint basics like lists and forms and what a web part is, that kind of a thing. Then we're going to dig into remote provisioning and compare that with the SharePoint add-in model. Now, I'm not going to assume that you know or don't know the SharePoint add-in model, but I'm not going to go into much depth on it except to compare it a little bit with this new remote provisioning pattern. Then I'm going to show you how to build a solution in AngularJS that can be packaged in a very flexible way, either as a SharePoint add-in, as a drag and drop solution that an end user might install, or as a centrally managed solution that IT might provision into hundreds or thousands of sites. What is AngularJS? Well, it's an extremely popular framework. The chart is actually from Google Trends and just shows, based on search traffic, the interest in these different popular JavaScript frameworks. And although they don't really give us an index on the y-axis to see exactly how much interest there is, you can see that over the last few years, Angular has really separated itself from the pack in terms of interest. A lot of enterprises like it because it's maintained by Google, which means that there's a good bet that it's going to be supported for a long time, and Google uses it for a lot of their own properties. It actually provides HTML templates, data binding, and other tools that allow you to manage a larger scale, more maintainable application than you would if you were talking directly to the browser's document object model. It also adds new HTML elements and attributes that allow you to build these applications. You can almost think of it as ASP.NET MVC for the browser. It runs completely in the browser, completely in JavaScript. It's vendor agnostic, but it does a lot of the same things that MVC does. A typical AngularJS application looks something like this. You have a view, which is HTML with bindings, and the rule is to not put any procedural code in the view. Then you have underneath of that the controller, which sort of runs the UI for you, if you will, and communicates with the view through data binding. A lot of people use the $scope Angular service to communicate between the controller and the view, but personally I like using the view model pattern, probably because I'm a reformed Silverlight developer and I liked the model view model or MVVM pattern. Angular is pretty flexible with respect to this, and it works well with an MVC pattern or MVVM or other variations. There are also services. A lot of them come with Angular and you can write your own, and these are just simple components that provide some kind of a service for you, like access to web services or navigation in the browser. Then there are directives where you can actually create your own new elements and attributes that fit right into your HTML, and routes, which are used for navigation in a single page application. Now, we're not really going to use them very much here because we're really focused on running inside of the SharePoint application on behalf of web parts and forms, so we don't really need to navigate within those things. Now let's take a look at some of the commonly used services found in Angular. $HTTP is a very handy one. It makes it easier to make HTTP calls, and it works well with the promises object $Q service, $Q, which kind of makes it a lot more manageable to do asynchronous operations. In other words, everything in JavaScript is asynchronous. If you make a REST call, the next line of code that runs is not going to be the completion of your REST call. The next line of code that runs is just going to say, okay, I sent it out. I'll call you back later. And those callbacks are a whole lot easier to manage if you use promises. So all that's built in. The browser location, they've made that easier to deal with the $location service. There's a logging service. There's all kinds of services actually. We're going to mainly use HTTP and the promises, and we're also going to write a custom service or a couple of custom services to sort of modularize the application. But before we go there, let's just start with a simple demo, which I call AngularJS from scratch. And you can follow along. If you have a web browser handy, just go to http://bit.ly/plunk1, that's PLUNK1 with a capital P, to get to the first demo. Okay, so now I'm going to start by just navigating to http://bit.ly/plunk1. And why do I say plunk? Well, because we're actually going to a tool called Plunker, which is a great little tool for roughing out JavaScript type solutions, and it's a great way to get started here. So you'll get the same plunk from the same URL, and then you can play with it and save it as under your own URL if you want to. Let's just go ahead and run this. This is sort of like the hello world example, and if I type something, it's actually going to just say hello collab 365 or whatever I type in, right? So let's take a look at how this works. I've got my HTML file, and there's nothing too unusual about that. You can see here that I'm bringing in the Angular library, and I've got my own script in there, and that's really all that I have going on. Now, the body tag has an interesting attribute on it called ng-app. That means that this is an Angular app, and it's called hello app. It also has something called ng-controller, which is also part of the Angular framework and tells me that I have a controller, which, remember, the controller is the thing that controls the view. So I'm essentially setting up the data binding here to the main controller. Now I can start using data binding expressions. For instance, vm.name is the name that I type. So notice that it's here, vm.name, in the heading, and it's also down here in this input box. This is how you would bind to an input box. So if I say hello Bob, for instance, it'll say hello Bob. There's also a neat little piece of functionality here, which is that if I don't have anything, it doesn't put it just says hello with the exclamation point, and it cleverly adds the space if I type something, right? And you'll see here that in the data binding expression, I'm calling a function, vm.space. So let's look at the script file and see the other side of this. It's really simple. Angular is a symbol that's the only thing that goes in the global namespace from Angular. Then I'm creating a module called hello app. So that connects to the hello app reference that I made in the ng-app attribute out on the page. And then here's my main controller. And the controller just has a function in it, not a whole lot. Single function, I'm passing it in. The name here doesn't matter. It doesn't even really need a name. I could take that away, and it'll still work. Anyway, I'm going to use the view model pattern, which means that I'm making the view model is the controller. So I'm saying this is the view model. And then I'm just defining this little function, vm.space, which just knows to return an extra space if the name is empty. And that's my whole application. Hard to get much simpler than that, but I wanted to start simple. Now here's one that's a bit more complex that you could probably spend some time playing around with if you're new to Angular. And this is bit.ly/plunk2. Now this shows quite a few more concepts. This is the Angular weather app. And so what this does is it actually goes out and fetches the weather, and you'll see here that I'm in Watertown, Mass, in the United States, and if I type that in, I'm going to get the weather forecast for right here. Simple enough, or the weather conditions anyway. So I'm calling a free web service to do that, and you'll see here that my app is a little bit more complex. Here's my ng-app of the weather app. Here's my controller, same as before. But I don't have the whole UI in here. Instead, I have this ng-include. So I'm bringing in a template, an HTML template to display the weather. And I'm only going to show it if I have valid data loaded. So ng-show turns the element and all of its children off or on, depending on whether it's true or false. What that allows me to do is when I first run, I don't really show kind of a broken or empty weather forecast. But if I type something, that seems a little bit nicer, then it will show this little HTML template. Then here's the form, and you can see it's very much like the other one where I'm using ng model to pass in my query. And when you click, I'm calling the MV search function. Make sense? So it's really just the same pattern over again. My script here is again fairly similar. This time when I actually do a search, it's going to call the weather service. So notice that I have declared this weather service. And for those of you who have used dependency injection in other environments, this is actually to help the dependency injection inside of Angular. So yeah, it has dependency injection too. GetWeather is going to take my query and return a promise, which is the then function that comes back. And then I can just fill in all these little properties here, city, condition, description, etc., and ultimately set that the valid data is loaded. Now, these things aren't going to get all rendered inside of index.html. Some of them are going to get rendered inside of this weatherdisplay.html that I had included. And you'll see it's just a partial HTML, and I've got some data binding in here. For instance, the condition or the weather icon. Right? I also have a repeat, an ng repeat here, which shows how this little table works. So it's actually going to go through all the different Celsius, Fahrenheit, and Kelvin options that I have here and fill all those in. So a lot of little things to pick up from this. The weather service itself is going to call a web service out on the web, the openweathermap.org web service. Again, using promises. So you see how the promises just sort of make things read from top to bottom. When this thing completes, I'm going to get back my response data, or I'm going to catch an error, right? If I get the response data, then all I have to do is return that up to my caller. So pretty simple stuff, but now we're actually doing something kind of useful, right? I mean, this is actually useful. Now let's take a pause and see how this looks in SharePoint. So here we are in SharePoint, and here's the same weather situation, or the same little weather application, and it's actually running in a SharePoint hosted app. I can come in here and edit it, and you'll see that I can actually change the city that's being displayed here. So let's go back to Miami, for instance. And there, see, it works. So this is pretty simple, and what's nice is this is a SharePoint hosted app, and I have the exact same weatherdisplay.html, the same scripts, and even the only difference is that I have my weather is actually being displayed on this little web part. So this is the same code that was on index.html. It's just now it's on an ASP.NET page that supports the SharePoint environment. So perhaps you're starting to get the idea of where this is going, right? I mean, the weather app is really just a widget. It's really just a little thing that fits on the page, and I can drop it into a SharePoint hosted app pretty easily. So let's look at how we could evolve this and actually use it in other useful ways inside of a SharePoint environment. Okay, so now back to the slides for a couple more concepts. I want to introduce the idea of remote provisioning. Remote provisioning is kind of the other app model. It's actually been around longer than the app model, but it's just a pattern. It's not an official model, although Microsoft has been promoting it quite a bit recently through their OfficeDev Patterns and Practices site. The idea is simple. Instead of having the app or add-in run in a separate SharePoint site with a separate URL and all this special protection going on between the add-in and SharePoint, we just put the script right into the SharePoint site. And it can run, say, in a content editor web part or on a SharePoint page. You don't really need the whole add-in model. There's a time for it, but sometimes it's a bit more complex than you really need. Some examples of remote provisioning might include .NET code in a PowerShell or console application. That's what I'm going to use. JavaScript in a SharePoint hosted app or content editor web part. I'll show that too. .NET code in a provider hosted app. There's quite a few examples of that up on the Office Patterns and Practices site. Even the Mechanical Turk approach, which means somebody manually uploading the scripts and other content, works just fine if you don't need to scale it to a lot of different sites. So why would I choose one or the other? Well, here's my little Consumer Reports version of the analysis on this, sort of the way I look at it. If I want to provision this across many different sites, the add-in models or remote provisioning work well. But the way it gets on the sites is really different. You see, the add-in models use a storefront distribution system. So the idea is that users are going to go to the storefront, decide they want the weather on their page, and pick out the app. That happens sometimes, but you kind of need your power user type people to do that. It's not going to happen widely. But what if you want to set up, say, a site for every project in your company, or for every product or every customer? I once designed a property management system for a property management company where they had a SharePoint site for each property that contained photos, maps, contracts, contacts, all kinds of useful things. I also built one once for a pharmaceutical company that kept track of each compound. You're getting the idea, right? I'm sure you've seen this pattern. The storefront distribution is not really what you want for that. What you want for that is you want to kind of centrally distribute the same applications and the same site patterns to each site. And so I think that when you're looking at the user pulling something down from a storefront and you don't completely trust the code, then the add-in model is perfect. But if you want to distribute something centrally, or if you just want a lighter weight mechanism, then the remote provisioning model works a lot better. In fact, you might not even have the add-in model configured on premises. You might even be using SharePoint 2010. Remote provisioning can still work as long as you stay within the APIs that are available, say on an older version of SharePoint. So I'd like to go to a demo that shows us these concepts in a lot more depth. It's a MicroSurvey. It's a little baby survey. I'm sure you've seen these before. Somewhere on the page is this little rectangle that asks you a question, and you click one of the answers, and then it shows you what the other people answered. Very simple. This MicroSurvey is an Angular application, and it can run in all these different ways. It can be an add-in, or it can be remote provisioned. Now, you're going to see this working. There's a couple of views which are handled by those HTML templates. There's main.html, which shows the survey and the results. And then there's settings.html, which actually allows you to control the questions and even provisions the questions, the lists that store the questions and answers. So we're going to see remote provisioning from the browser. When an administrator goes to use it, it can actually go ahead and update the storage. Underneath of those, there's a survey service, which is a custom service that I wrote, which knows about surveys. It can do things like retrieve a question or store an answer. So it's kind of high level. Below that is another service I wrote called SP Data Service that knows more about SharePoint lists and libraries. So it can do things like ensure that a list is there that you need to use, or write a row to a list, or read a row from a list. The other thing that's in here is a little piece of code called init UI. I have a whole blog article about it, so I'm not going to go into too much depth. But what that does is allow you to run an Angular app in, say, a web part that is on the page with potentially other Angular apps. So it just helps everything to get along. That ng app directive you saw in my other examples, the problem with that is that you can only have one ng app on a page, whereas my init UI function or script can actually handle many scripts on the page. Okay, so let's take a look at this. By the way, you can follow along too. If you want to look at the source code, just go to bit.ly/u, capital SURVEY, which was my way of saying MicroSurvey without typing the actual mu character. So if you go there, it'll bring you to GitHub and this exact demo. There's a lot of great things up here in the patterns and practices. It's the OfficeDev patterns and practices area. And there's a lot of samples. All the PowerShell library that I'm going to use for the demo is here, as well as a core library and a bunch of other useful stuff. So I really recommend that. And if you want to follow along, just go right into the MicroSurvey and you can actually examine all the, it's actually not under script, it's under survey app. You can actually see all of the JavaScript and HTML and everything that makes this work. Okay, so I'm going to start off by showing you the survey itself. This is the MicroSurvey running as a SharePoint hosted app. Sorry, SharePoint hosted add-in. I'm in a New York state of mind today, so I'll make my favorite, I'll click on New York as my favorite vacation state, and you'll see that it's collated all the answers and it's giving me this little chart. Now if I go into the MicroSurvey app itself, you'll see a little bit more on the display. You'll see that in addition to a little snapshot of the survey, it's giving me the chance to edit the questions, check on the answers, and it's also doing a SharePoint content check. This is what it's doing instead of using the feature framework in SharePoint to provision the list, and it's actually doing that in JavaScript code. So this kind of assumes that the first person to run it is going to be an administrator. It is also using a pattern that's inspired by the desired state configuration pattern that a lot of admins use and PowerShell people use. The idea being that, you know, I might want to run this again and again, and I don't want it to fail. If I say create list and then add the answers column to the list and then add the answers column to the all items view, etc., I could do that, but the second time I ran it, it would fail because those things would already be there. So it's taking a little bit more of a cautious approach and saying, well, only create the list if it's needed, only create the column if it's needed, etc. And you can see here it didn't actually need to do anything. Now, the questions are actually stored inside of a list. And so I can come here and edit them. And if I want, I could add a new one. And you'll see here that I have a custom form. So let's see, what would be a good question? What's the best part of the Collab 365 conference? So let's see, I think no travel is great. The sessions hopefully are good. The food and the parties, well, I don't know how that works in a remote conference, but anyway, there's my new question, and now you can see that if I go back to my application, I have the new question, and if I want to, I can go back to the questions and click on it, and you'll see the display form is a little different as well, and shows me a snapshot of the answers, gives me a chance to edit, etc. So one of the things I want to do is, when we get to the code walkthrough, is show you how to wire up your own forms in that manner. And it's actually using the same code for this display as it does the code, the display that's in the forms, and the display that's here in the web part. It's all the same stuff. Now, one thing you might notice, because it's a SharePoint hosted app, is that the URL is different. So msurveyapp.dev.13 is the location of my site, but if I right click here, go into properties, you'll see that the actual URL is this funny thing with a GUID in it, and that's the way the add-in model works. This is to protect SharePoint from add-ins that you might download from the store that might do more than you want them to, right? So maybe in addition to the MicroSurvey, it also uploads all your confidential files to the add-in vendor's, evil lair or something like that, right? Seems unlikely, but that extra level of protection is built into phone apps, and so it's also built into the SharePoint add-ins as well. But it sort of adds a little extra complexity. For instance, the fact that this MicroSurvey is running in an iframe is kind of okay here, but if I wanted to do certain other things to the site, I really wouldn't be able to. Also, all of these lists, they're actually also in the app web. So they're under this funny GUID URL as well. So let's take a look at the code for just a second, and then I'll show you some other ways of deploying this. This is a pretty standard SharePoint hosted add-in. So I've got my pages here. I've got two pages, default and the web part page. Default has this is the settings page, right, that you saw, and it's got a bunch of SharePoint goo on it. And then here you can see that I've got my add-in. This is Angular code, so I'm saying ng controller settings as VM, ng includes settings.html. And so here's the, over here you can see the settings.html and the settings controller, right? And then it's doing the main one as well. So that's taking care of the left and right sides of the screen, where the left side was the, was doing the provisioning, and the right side was showing a little sample of the survey, right? If I go into just the web part one, you'll see it's a little simpler, and then I'm just bringing in the one HTML template. Main.html. Now, what you'll notice is that there is no ng app directive, right? Normally I would put that up here, say, wrapping all of my Angular logic, but then I'd only be able to use this once on the page. That's fine actually in a SharePoint hosted app, because the SharePoint hosted app is isolated. If I had two add-ins, two SharePoint hosted add-ins, they'd be under different sites with different GUIDs to isolate them from each other. But I want to do some other things with this, so I'm actually calling survey app slash init UI. This is that little init UI script that I mentioned before, and I'm going to dig into that just a little bit and show you how that works as well. But this will allow me to actually put more than one Angular app on the same page, which becomes relevant when we get rid of the iframes and start putting the add-in directly on a SharePoint page. So let me show you how that works. It turns out that everything in my add-in is here in this one folder, Survey App. So everything I need, Angular, all of the pages for the forms, the display form, the edit form, the new form is down here. Here's the different HTML templates and controllers, the SP data service. This is kind of similar to the one we looked at in the weather service. All of these things for actually going out and doing all the RESTful calls. There's also a survey service that's a little bit higher level. So SP data service knows how to, say, create a list. The survey service knows what lists are needed for the survey. So that's just sort of the way I abstracted it. Now I could take this whole thing, and let me just open up Windows Explorer here and get these files. And now I'm going to go back to my web browser, and I'm just going to go to a fresh team site. This is a new team site that hasn't been used before. And I'm going to go into site contents, and I like to put these things into site assets because it's an asset, right? And I'm going to make a folder called Survey App. And now all I have to do to deploy this is just drag and drop all the files into the SharePoint library. Now, that may seem a little strange, but on the other hand, maybe not. You've probably had the experience of finding some little widget, maybe that does some tabs or something else on your screen, and uploading that into your website. This is the same thing, except it's a little bit easier because I don't really need to mess with it very much. I don't need to create lists and things underneath because the deployment code is going to do that for me. So in fact, I'm just going to grab a copy of this URL for later, and you'll see where that comes in. And then click on the default page and watch what happens. Immediately my web part comes up. This is the settings page. And look, it created the questions list. It created the answers column in the questions list. It added the column. It set the display and edit forms. So it's like, whoa, this is all deploying itself now. And it just assumes that the first person to run it has permission to do that. If I just click again, then you'll see that it's actually going to revert to that other behavior where it says, no, I don't really need to create anything. It was already there. Now I can ask a question. And when I go back to the main site, I can actually use this to put the web part on the site. So all I'm going to do is use our good old friend, the content editor web part. And remember, I copied that URL to my clipboard. That was of an HTML file. Well, that HTML file is the one that brings in our little app. And so there it is, right? It's working. The only problem is if I hit save, it's actually going to stop working. And the reason it stopped working is because my site has something called minimal download strategy. And you can tell that that's working by looking carefully at the URL. If you notice here, it says start.aspx # and then the actual URL. So this is sort of simulating a more dynamic website that doesn't refresh the page. It actually refreshes the page and just sends the differences down to your site, which in some cases is more efficient, in some cases is actually less efficient. And it is very difficult to run script directly on the page if you have this enabled. So to disable it, I'm just going to come in and go into Manage Site Features. So this is on the web, not the site collection. And here's the minimal download strategy feature. I'll deactivate that. And when I go back to my site, there's my little survey, and it's all working just fine. Right inside of a content editor web part. So that's pretty handy if what I want to do is deploy this to a single location. But what if I want to deploy this to dozens or hundreds of locations? Well, let me show you how that might work. I'm going to go to another fresh team site. And this time I'm going to bring up PowerShell. And inside of here I actually have a few different PowerShell scripts, including one called install MicroSurvey scripts, which I've already run, and install MicroSurvey. So install MicroSurvey scripts, basically what that does is it takes all of the scripts that I had, and this is another site, this is where I have my scripts, and those same files are there, so it just moves those into place. And now here's where I'm going to actually install the solution to, and all I have to do now is just type install MicroSurvey and the URL of the site. So what it's going to do now is prompt me for credentials. So I'll show you how this works when we get into the PowerShell. This could be passed in as a parameter. If I wanted to loop through 1,000 sites and do the same thing, I could do it and only have to enter my credentials once. And now it's going to deploy just a few files. These are just the files that the app is going to run inside of. So default.aspx is the main settings page, the 3 display forms, and the web part. Those all need to get pushed out to each site, but they don't have much in them. All they really have in them is the tags that the add-in is going to run inside of. So I could change the add-in by just updating the scripts centrally. Not only did it move those files into place, but it added a site settings list, it added the web part to the home page, it turned off the minimal download strategy, and it created all the lists that I needed as well. Why? Because maybe the first person to come along doesn't have permission, right? So that's not so bad in the drag and drop scenario where the person doing the dragging and dropping is going to go in there and click it. They obviously have permission. Here, maybe just an ordinary user is going to come along one day and refresh the page, and hey, look, there's the MicroSurvey right on the page, right? Now, not only that, but I can go into my site settings, and there's a new link, Manage MicroSurvey. So I can come in here, and that brings me to that survey page, right, or to the settings page. Now I can come in and ask a question. Not giving much of a choice here, I suppose. And there's my MicroSurvey working on the page. Okay, so that's kind of the demo part. Now let's do a bit of code walkthrough to see how all this stuff works. So going back to Visual Studio, I'm going to start by looking at that site provisioning code. So that comes from here in the settings controller. And settings controller is actually going to ensure that all the content that it needs is there. So it's going to call the survey service, right? Remember, our dependency injection here is going to put the survey service in place for us, passing it in as an argument so that I can just go ahead and call something on survey service, and ensure content is going to run. Inside the survey service, you can see the actual provisioning code, and this is where promises sort of show their stuff, right? Because what is survey service ensure content going to do? Well, it's going to ensure there's a list called questions, then it's going to ensure there's an answers field in there, then it's going to ensure that the forms are set up, then it's going to ensure that there's an answers list, etc. So it's just going to go through all this stuff, and notice how it just says then. So it reads from top to bottom, even though the reality is that these are all asynchronous callbacks through the wonder of promises. Ensure list runs, and then the reality is we're going to fall all the way through the bottom of the function. And then this then function is going to get called when the promise returns and says, okay, I've ensured that there's a list called questions. Now I need to look at the answers field. And then it will do that and return another promise, which will then get called when that completes. So it allows you to read your code from top to bottom, but if you go into the debugger, you'll see that it's actually getting called asynchronously. Let's look inside of the SP data service, which is what survey service uses to say ensure that a list is there, or ensure that there's a column in a list. So a few little utility functions here, specifically for calling the web services inside of SharePoint. And we get into the fun stuff. So ensure list, this is what it looks like to first check if there's a list in SharePoint. So calling _API/list/get by title, right? And hey, I could do this from my browser, right? Right? If I just paste in the end of the URL from the code, you'll see that it actually does give me back the questions list and all the details in that list, and I can get to the contents and everything. So this is a great way to kind of walk through or test out the APIs. So the code itself, again, is going to check and see if the list is there. If it finds it, then it's going to call ensure list 2 from here. So actually, I'm sorry, if it finds it, it's just going to say I found it. If it doesn't find it and I get a 404, which is a not found error, then it's going to call ensure list 2, which will create it. And this is what it looks like to create a list in SharePoint. And then you can look through the column to see how it, look through the code to see how to create a column, etc. I'm going to kind of fast forward to another interesting and somewhat different piece of functionality here, which is how to set the forms. So the forms, right, the forms are just these ASPX pages, and let's take a look at the edit form, for instance. It has the same exact type of Angular setup on it. Here's the list form HTML, and that is bound to this controller, and then I've got my main one to show the little preview of the form, of what the question's going to look like, right? So those need to be bound to the list, and that's what this does. It takes a list name, the content type name for the questions in this case, and then the URL for the new form, the display form, and the edit form. And for this, I couldn't find a way to do this in REST, so I used the JavaScript object model, or JSON, and this works just great. So I can go ahead and get the all these different parameters, go ahead and get my context, and then I'm going to have to go in and get the list content types, And when I return, I'm going to iterate through those, find the one that matches the one that I'm looking for, and then go ahead and set the URLs, do an update of those content types, and then finally I'm going to get back my result and I can complete the promise to my caller. So that's how you create custom forms. Now, a lot of people will go in and edit the forms and find different ways, like SharePoint Designer or what have you, to edit the out-of-the-box forms. You can do that, but then if they change the out-of-the-box form someday, you're going to be out of luck. So I kind of prefer this approach because the forms are completely contained inside the app. It means I have to write them, but I can also make them look really different if I want to, as you were able to see. So digging into the actual survey itself, here's the main HTML. So it has a spot for the question, right? And there's that little binding expression. It has the answers. So here's a binding expression for the different buttons that are there. And this is all the question panel, right? And then here's the results panel. And I'm using ng show to control whether I'm seeing it in question mode or result mode. The controller for this is actually going to come in here and get the question to display, and then it's going to get the choices of different answers from there, and it's going to display those. When somebody clicks, it's just storing the answers in a comma separated mode. When somebody clicks, it's updating the answers list. So fairly straightforward there. I'll let you kind of look through that a little bit more on your own. Another thing that I want to show though is how the actual provisioning worked. So let's go down here and take a look at some PowerShell code. So here's the MicroSurvey installer that we used, and this is making use of something called the PowerShell library from Patterns and Practices. And so you'll see that it begins with, or the first real line of code here is connect SP online. And remember I said we could take the credentials as an argument, so they're going to get passed in as an argument. But if there was no, if my caller didn't have the credentials passed in, then I'm going to call get credential, and that's what you saw happen when I ran the script. So connect SP online is this is fully open source. You can go in and take a look at how they did this up in the Patterns and Practices repo. And it's actually going to go ahead and connect to a single site. So, or sorry, a single SP web really, the SharePoint web. And then I can do things like add the folder for the site assets, go through the central deployment. This folder here, the central deploy folder, these are the things that I have to deploy centrally. And because I wanted to be able to make it flexible where the scripts are installed, these are actually little templates that will do a little app path substitution. So wherever it sees app path, it's going to put the location of that scripts folder. And so here it's actually looping through the files, and if the file ends in .template, it's going to replace the app path with wherever the scripts are, strip off the .template off the file name, and then this is the command to upload a file using the PowerShell library. This disables the minimal download strategy, so there's PowerShell for everything in there. It's pretty amazing. And then I can go ahead and add that site settings link and add the web part to the page. If I didn't have a wiki page, there's also calls for regular SharePoint pages or publishing pages I could use. And then I'm going to set up the lists. And so this is how I would create the list and add the column to the list inside of the PowerShell. And I don't need to have a separate call to add it to the to add these columns to the view, because that's actually something built in here. I just say add to default view and the library takes care of that for me. So real nice and simple, and plenty of examples here hopefully to get you started. Okay, so I just want to take a minute to show you how this PowerShell library is constructed. Um, the OfficeDev Patterns and Practices library is everything inside of the orange box here. At its foundation, it has something called a core library. And what that is it sort of extends the normal CSOM, the client-side object model, with things that are missing from the CSOM and things that make it more convenient. For instance, it transparently deals with throttling. So you can't just do an unlimited number of calls to Office 365. You'll actually get throttled because somebody could use that to as a way of attacking Office 365 by flooding it with requests, right? So they limit the number of requests you can run, and then you have to sort of back off and try again later. All that try again later logic is built into the core library, so you don't need to worry about it. There's also a number of things that aren't really in the client object model that probably should be, and a lot of times it's just like a little magic. For instance, I ran into one where if you want a site property in the site property bag to be indexed, you have to add the name of that property to another property in the site property bag. It's not documented, and it's a little arcane. So they added that to the Patterns and Practices core library so you don't have to worry about it. The cool thing is that the Microsoft people behind the PNP library are actually working with the engineering team and going to them and saying, look, this feature was not in the CSOM. Could you please add it? Or if not, could you please document and support the way that we did it in the core library? So if it turns out there never will be a, add this site property to the search index function in the actual CSOM, then they're going to try to prevail on the engineering group to support the maybe it's a little bit of a hack way that they do it inside the core library so that it's no longer a hack. So that is a big plus to using the core library over just doing it yourself. Then running on top of that, there's different provisioning samples. There's CDN Manager, which is another technology that is sort of yet another option for doing some of this, that pulls scripts out of content delivery networks and puts them on pages. That's more useful if you're going to go in and write scripts kind of ad hoc right on the page, or in web parts directly on the page. The PowerShell commands use the core library, so they're very tightly bound to the core library. You'll find that they're very thin. In other words, the PowerShell commands don't do a lot. They just pretty much call one or two core library functions. And because it's all open source, if you want to know how to do something, or if you even want to add something to it that you might find missing, you can do that and then do a pull request and be famous and get your code up into the Patterns and Practices library. And they really do appreciate those kinds of contributions. So the PowerShell commands that came from there is what you saw demonstrated today. So I have here are some resources from the session. I have the code samples, once again, bit.ly/plunk1 and plunk2, and MicroSurvey, spelled with a lowercase u, survey. And then I have a bunch of links here. The PowerShell commandlet reference gets you to all those client-side commands. There's an AngularJS tutorial here, plus AngularJS training on Pluralsight. There's many of them up there, but I particularly liked this particular class. There's could be more documentation on the RESTful APIs, but this is a good starter, is how to complete basic operation using the SharePoint 2013 REST APIs. The trick about init UI, I didn't really go into it in this talk because there's a detailed blog article on this, so that I call the well-tempered AngularJS web part that explains how it works. And then again, that new guidance from Microsoft that explains, which is an article that explains why they're moving us away from the feature framework and into other things. So that's the main part of the session. And I'd now like to go ahead and I'll actually leave the resources up for you for a while. I'd like to go ahead and open it up to questions. And thanks very much for tuning in.